and I'm going to go over to the lecture notes. And today we're talking about browser games. And so this is kind of talking about like a specific style of distribution. And there's a few reasons why I like talking about browser games. So we're going to get into the history a little bit and then talk about some of the technical components of browser games. Um, so yeah, I'll just talk about this a little bit and then I'm going to show some examples. Again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to use the chat or just start talking on your mic. Either one of those is fine. Um, One of the reasons I like browser games is that's kind of where I started out in my career. My first game related job was my first job after college. I worked at a pretty small game studio that made kind of like puzzle games for websites, and we used Flash, which some of you guys have probably maybe heard of. Flash was finally kind of retired for good last year. Although in the time since then, a lot of like new Flash emulators have come up and stuff like that. So you can still play a lot of the old Flash games in the browser if you use one of those emulators. Um, Browser games are also a big way that indie games spread. So, we looked a little bit about the history of video games in terms of different platforms and technology and stuff like that. And we also looked at indie games and the development of different publishing platforms as well as game engines, making it easier for individuals and small studios to create their own games. And browser games was a big part of that because, like other things on the internet, early communities around browser-based games made certain games that were created by a single person or a small group very popular that in a way that probably wouldn't have been able to happen in earlier versions of video game distribution, where you kind of have a platform and then you have publishers that design stuff for the platform, and then the platform is, all those things are kind of tied together. So if you're working with like Atari or Nintendo or, PlayStation, things like that, usually you have to basically get commissioned or have a license or have some other relationship with the distribution platform to actually create a game for like a PlayStation or an Xbox or something like that. And you could, they would give you like a development version of the console that has like special features for testing and debugging and all that stuff. But in order to do that, you would have to have a relationship with those companies. And for a lot of individual artists and hobbyists and indie developers, we would never be able to have that type of a relationship with a big distributor like that if we were, just creating a game on our own. So browser games were a good way for indie developers to kind of publish their games. See in the chat. Uh, James is asking, I'm about to submit rewards assignment today. I was wondering, do coins and one-ups count as rewards? Yeah, both of those are perfectly good examples of rewards. We could take a look at that later as well if you want to show me what you're working on. Anyway, let's continue looking at browser games. So as I mentioned, Flash was kind of the big turning point for distributing games on the web. Flash was originally created by Macromedia, a software company, and then it was later bought by Adobe. And so it was first introduced in 1996, and it was basically like a plugin that worked inside of the browser, and it used a scripting language called ActionScript that is actually really similar to Godot script in that it combined object-oriented programming and JavaScript syntax, style syntax, but it worked directly with the game engine. So it was a very similar system to using Godot or Unity or other game engines that we have now, but it was used for interactive animations and games and just web content in general. So that was first introduced in 1996, and that made it possible to create basically interactive graphics on the web. And so that was the first time that creating a multimedia project or a video game was possible, just to publish directly in the browser and play directly in the browser. That led to a lot of early browser-based game communities. Newgrounds, Newgrounds is still around. I assume that a lot of you guys have probably been on Newgrounds at one point or another. But this was like a really big early community for publishing indie games and browser games specifically. And I definitely, as a kid, spent tons and tons of time playing games on this platform. And kind of in a similar way to how what we looked at with indie games, with browser games and communities and platforms like this, you see a lot of like cool projects and things that would never get made by a big studio, like things that have more of an artistic design or more of a kind of very niche design or something like that. So um, there's a lot more possibility for unique or uh, innovative games and types of expression. There's also a lot of like kind of silly stuff. One of the first like really famous browser-based games was this game Club a Seal. Um, I guess I still have it a link to this original thing. I have to open this in my other. Hold on, sorry. Forgot that I had an incognito window. Let me just stop this for a second and then stream my regular one. Oops. Okay. Shoot. Hmm. Okay, it doesn't seem to be an issue with the browser. It seems like there's actually just an error on this page, which is kind of new. Uh, okay. Well, we can try this later. Let's just go back. So I'm in the regular browser now. Okay. So anyway, we do have a screenshot from this game, and essentially, it's just kind of a silly. It's obviously just a silly game where it's this kind of like edgy joke where the whole game is just clubbing a seal. And so this was a really popular game. It's not necessarily the best game that's ever been created, but it's kind of an interesting moment for this style of game that you could create a really silly game. It's almost like creating a meme or something like that, but it actually is interactive. So games have, become something that anybody could make, anybody could sort of create and publish to make any type of commentary or tell any type of story. It's not just limited to the types of games that we get with the major consoles and platforms. Okay, so continuing on. Uh, a lot of these games, as we kind of talked about, are taking on unconventional or controversial topics. A couple more examples of indie games that were popular on Newgrounds. I'll just play these for a second. These games were like super popular. You can see like this one has 21 million views. This game, Alien Hominid, it's a pretty basic game, but the thing that I like about it is you can see it has these like really cool, just hand-drawn graphics. I'm going to turn down the volume a little bit. And it works just like, it works just as well as any regular game, but it has this kind of comic book style. And, it's created by just like a very small team, the same programmer who made the Club of Seal game along with an artist. Um, so it's a pretty basic like platformer, 2D platformer action style game. But it's got this sort of goofy environment. I'm not paying attention very well, so I'm kind of losing a lot, but uh, it's got this like cool hand-drawn environment. It's got this kind of like uh, like graffiti vibe going on. It's like very different than what you might have seen in a mainstream game at this time. So that's one example. Another one that became super popular was Meat Boy, which later became Super Meat Boy, which I'm sure you guys have heard. You can see this one has like 4 million views, so super popular game. I think, and became this like big franchise. And again, you'll notice this one looks like something that you could have created in Godot. Um, but this is this early browser-based game. So you'll notice the same type of like tile sets, the same type of animations, these small, it's not exactly pixel graphics, but it's these kind of like very simplified graphics. Um, I'll just play a little bit of this one. It has this like kind of comic book style narrative happening again. And it just kind of has like a really unique physics feel. So you're really sliding and there's a lot of momentum. So it's a little bit difficult to get used to at first, but eventually you kind of get how the controls work. I'm not paying close enough attention to actually get up here. There we go. But you can see a lot of the same stuff that we've looked at in our Godot lessons. We can see the tile sets, the really simple graphics, the same simple kind of interactions. But it's a game that it has it has a bunch of levels. It's a super popular game that was just created by a very small team of 3 people. Um, so we're kind of looking at some of these games that have kind of sort of grown out of that browser-based or indie game movement to become more popular. Another early browser game that became super popular is Bejeweled. This is another style of game that's more like a casual game and a puzzle game. And so it's targeting a different audience of people who are just playing games on their computer, during work or now we play them on our phone on our commute. But back in the Flash days, people would play these when they're killing time at work or doing something like that. Um, So then also out of this movement becomes indie games that have, more of an interesting kind of perspective on certain issues or politics. A developer that I really like who also creates a lot of indie developer tools for other people to use is the developer Mala Industra. And their games are like often politically charged games. They made this game where it's like a sim game. But you're playing as McDonald's basically. It's like McDonald's the video game, and it kind of takes you through all of the sort of like practices that are done by a big corporation like McDonald's to kind of get like sort of make uh, become corporately successful in uh, basically like dirty ways, like factory farming, like all these different sort of politically charged issues. This game kind of looks at those issues and gamifies it in a certain way, but also puts you in charge of the sort of like corporate business leaders who are running the company and making these decisions. And so it's kind of an interesting perspective to put a player in a game. Like usually in a mainstream video game, you'd be like the hero that's fighting against the evil corporations. But this game is kind of making a point by putting you actually in the perspective of the evil corporation. And Mala Industria work is really cool, not just because he's made like all these tools for other people to work with, but he's also just made a ton of games, um, most or all of which I think are playable on the web for free. And, not all of them have these overt political sort of messages to them. Some of them are just kind of fun or, about different things. So a lot of his work, like that McDonald's game when it first came out, was somewhat controversial. Some of his other games have been kind of controversial. But his work is very cool. And he also built like a game engine for P5, which I used to use when I first started teaching this class. I did it in the browser with P5, and we did a lot of the same kind of things that we do with Godot, but we had to write a lot more code for that. So Godot makes a lot of those things easier, and it's also you can build it for the browser. So that's kind of a simpler way to go. Um, but anyway, moving forward, so in 2007, the iPhone is released, and one of the things that happened is that they didn't support Flash. And so anyone who got an iPhone kind of like early on was, if you were a Flash developer, like I was when I first started my career, this was this kind of huge thing because it was like everybody's going to get these iPhones and start using the internet on their phone instead of their computer. And there's no support for Flash. So anything that we make that's supposed to be played on the browser, people on the iPhone, not only is it not going to work, it's just going to show like a big error there. So everybody had to kind of start thinking about other ways to create games. And in a way, that was good because it led people back to the original web technologies like JavaScript and also updating the standards of the web. For example, creating HTML5, which allowed for more multimedia and graphics. And that led to things like P5, if any of you guys have used P5 in the programming classes, or just played browser games in general, what you've probably been playing is HTML5 based games. So the end of Flash was bad in a sense because it kind of like all these games that had been created for Flash were no longer going to be supported, and people who were doing that weren't going to be able to continue working in that format. And Flash had a lot of issues. The main one was that it was closed. So in most websites, you can inspect the code and see how it works and learn from it. In Flash, you couldn't do that. It was just this kind of black box that was embedded on the page. And so this led people to kind of go back to those original technologies, specifically developing more with JavaScript to create JavaScript-based games. So that led to the rise of HTML and JavaScript-based games. Another thing that you'll see with these games is they're a lot more, they can use data and they can connect to the internet. We started seeing networked games, so we'll see a few versions of that. This game, Google Maps Play Cube, doesn't exist anymore, but I think there's a video of it linked here. And this was a really cool sort of concept game where they turned actual maps in Google Maps using the 3D models into the game where you have to lead the marble through the streets. And so this was a really cool project, and you could see how we could combine graphics and data from different web services to create games. There's also really simple games. So like, this Candy Box game is this kind of RPG game where it starts out really simple. You're just kind of like getting these candies, and then if you eat all the candies, it'll tell you that you've eaten all the candies. But if you don't, eventually you'll accumulate the candies and you can do other things with them. So it's really simple, like RPG resource management game. I forget exactly how long we have to go before interesting stuff happens, but I think it's kind of a while. Um, but this was a game that didn't really rely on Flash graphics, but still has, interesting game elements going on. Um, Another one that's kind of similar but much more complex is A Dark Room. This is some that maybe some of you guys have played. I think it's gotten more famous over the years. Um, but this is like a really complex RPG with resource management, and you have to like do a lot of different stuff, and it kind of gets really complex as you play the game. There's an iOS version now, which is actually the one that I originally played. But the web-based version doesn't use any graphics again. It's just using CSS animations and JavaScript and text to create the game world. So it's kind of going back to these earlier technologies, but making this really interesting game. So Dark Room is really good. If you haven't seen it before, I would definitely recommend checking it out. A couple other examples that are bringing like networked stuff into game development. Freerider, I don't know if this game was that popular, but I think it's a really good example of a sort of game that has a big community around it, where the basic game is pretty simple. You're just kind of driving, or you're riding a bicycle, and there's lots of different like flips and tricks that you can do. Let's see a quick version of this. Not sure if it's loading. Okay. So yeah, you can see it's basically just like a physics simulation game where you are on this bicycle and you can kind of speed up and you have to lean forward and keep your balance. But the thing that makes it really cool is that all the maps are just these kind of simple line drawings. And so it's really easy for users to create their own maps and publish them on this website. So that's another thing that can be done in browser-based games that's simpler than doing it in platform-based games. Although, of course, there is a lot of networked games for platforms now. But creating the community and all of that stuff around that style of game is much easier to do on the web. Another example of this is Agar.io. Um, uh-oh. For some reason, my browser is like not happy today. Maybe I need to just clear the cache or something, but it's not enjoying running this stuff. Here we go. So even if you haven't seen Agar.io before, you've probably seen games that are similar to it because it kind of spawned this whole genre of HTML5 based games that have very, very simple game styles. Some of them have actually gotten much more complex. Agar.io, you're just like a blob and you can just eat other blobs and you try to avoid getting eaten by bigger blobs. Yeah, so we can see that guy can eat me. So I need to get bigger. I'm gonna run away. Or I could hide in here. And there's a big guy down there. But this style of game spawned like millions of sort of like copies, essentially, some of which have become really popular. A lot of which are just, cool things to make and kind of like learn how to develop a game. And this uses network technology that basically, like before these types of games started being made in like 2015, the internet really wasn't like fast enough to run a game like this, where, it's connecting lots of different users at the same time and basically running like a real time simulation. Um, so a few other things that building stuff in the browser actually kind of gives us this advantage in terms of using data, using networks, using the basic web technologies that we don't have access to with other types of platforms. So then following that, in the last like 6 or 7 years, we've seen a sort of like resurgence of those browser-based game distribution platforms like Newgrounds that were really popular like 20 years ago in places like itch.io, which is the one that I tend to use most, but there's a lot of others like GameJolt and things like that where people are starting to publish web-based games again. And that's one of the things that we'll be doing at the end of the semester using Godot is publishing our game for the web. And that makes it easier for, in a lot of ways, to distribute the game, to have other people play and test the game, and basically be able to share the game with other people. And itch.io is really cool because it adds like this extra level of sort of categorization and sorting to these game communities. So with Newgrounds, you would kind of just log on and see if there were any new games, and you might rate them or add a comment or something like that. But now we have these like super sophisticated tagging systems on these different platforms, so you can find like really specific types of games by looking at these different tags. Like, so we're looking at the top HTML5 games. So these are games that can be played in the browser, and you can see really popular games here. I guess they don't really tell you how many views they have or things like that, but a lot of these games at the top of this list are, have become really popular games. But we can also look for really specific games, like we could look for pixel art, and then we could add like horror to it. And we can find these like super niche types of games that we might want to play. And you can also see there's a ton of these games. Like this thing will just keep refreshing. And the itch.io and these other distribution platforms have led to this big resurgence in these type of communities and like a huge explosion of game jams and indie developers creating games. And you can see, so yeah, there's 4,000 different games that are HTML5 with a horror and a pixel art tag. So there's 4,000 different games that you can look at that fit into this like specific genre. So this has just led to, this ease of distribution and publishing has led to like a real explosion of the indie game and browser game development. So I think that's it for this one. I'm gonna stop my